Our world has been shaped by forgotten disasters. Ancient catastrophes did far more than just destroy cities or claim lives. They acted as a giant reset button for human civilization, wiping the slate clean and forcing our ancestors to start over. We will uncover 20 of these pivotal events that fundamentally altered our timeline. You will discover how a single volcanic eruption nearly erased humanity and why a sudden ice age delayed farming for centuries. This journey reveals the fragile nature of our progress and the incredible resilience that allowed us to rebuild. What does it take for a society to truly begin again? A catastrophe becomes history-altering not in its initial shock, but in the long echo that follows. The true measure of these events lies not just in the cities they topple, but in the knowledge they erase and the very trajectory of human development they permanently bend. Think of an ancient civilization as a vast, intricate machine with each part relying on the others. Farmers feed the artisans, who supply the soldiers, who protect the traders, who bring in the rare materials that fuel new inventions. It is a beautiful, fragile system of interdependence. Now imagine a massive disruption, like a supervolcanic eruption that chokes the skies for years. The immediate destruction is terrible, but the real collapse begins with the domino effect. Crops fail across the globe, famine spreads, the farmers can no longer feed the city dwellers. The artisans, weak with hunger, can no longer produce their goods. Trade routes, the lifeblood of empires, fall silent as there is nothing left to trade. The soldiers, unpaid and starving, abandon their posts, and suddenly the entire complex system unravels. This is what historians like Eric Klein call a systems collapse, where interconnected societies unravel under a cascade of stresses. It is in this unraveling that the slate is wiped clean. Grand cities are abandoned to the desert sands. Advanced techniques for metalworking or astronomy are forgotten, lost for centuries. Entire languages and histories fade from memory, but from this emptiness something new must always emerge. The survivors migrate, forming new communities. They are forced to innovate with what little remains, sometimes stumbling upon entirely new ways of living. The old power structures crumble, making way for new leaders and new ideas. This cyclical pattern of collapse and rebirth is the hidden rhythm of our history. It forces us to ask a profound question. What does it truly take for a society to not just fall, but to fundamentally begin again? Around 74,000 years ago, a mountain in Indonesia named Toba exploded with a force that defies comprehension. It was not merely an eruption, it was a planetary event. The volcano ejected so much rock and ash into the atmosphere that it blocked the sun, plunging the world into a volcanic winter that may have lasted a decade. Temperatures plummeted globally, acid rain fell, vast forests died. For the small, scattered populations of early humans, this was an existential crisis. The world they knew simply vanished, replaced by a cold, dim, and barren landscape. Food sources disappeared almost overnight. This is the heart of the Toba catastrophe theory, a hypothesis suggesting our species was pushed to the very brink of extinction. Genetic studies indicate that all of modern humanity may have descended from a population that shrank to just a few thousand breeding pairs. We are the children of an unimaginably small group of survivors. This was more than a disaster, it was a filter. Those who lived through it were the most resilient, the most adaptable, or simply the luckiest. The harsh new world demanded new strategies for survival. Social bonds would have become more critical than ever. as sharing resources and cooperating in small bands meant the difference between life and death. Some archaeologists argue this extreme pressure may have accelerated the development of more sophisticated tools and complex communication, forcing a cognitive and cultural leap. Yet, this theory is not without its controversies. Some researchers point to evidence that certain regions, like South Africa, show signs of continuous human occupation, suggesting the effects might not have been uniformly catastrophic across the entire planet. The debate continues, a testament to the difficulty of reading such a distant chapter in our history. But whether Toba was a global bottleneck or a severe regional crisis, its story underscores a profound truth. A single geological event can act as a sculptor of our very DNA, a violent reset that cleaves one potential future away and forces humanity down a new, uncharted path. What other near misses have secretly shaped who we are today? Just as humanity was beginning to emerge from the long ice age, a new calamity struck from the heavens. Roughly 12,800 years ago, the planet was warming, glaciers were retreating, and our ancestors were experimenting with the first seeds of agriculture. Then, with shocking speed, the seasons reversed. This period is known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden plunge back into near-glacial conditions that lasted for over 1,000 years. The cause of this dramatic freeze has sparked one of the most contentious debates in modern science. A compelling theory suggests our planet was struck by fragments of a comet. The evidence is written in a thin, dark layer of sediment found across 4 continents. Within this layer, scientists have discovered microscopic nanodiamonds, materials that only form under immense pressure and heat, alongside tiny spheres of melted glass. These are the undeniable fingerprints of a cosmic impact. The consequences were immediate and devastating. The already fragile experiments in cultivating plants were utterly abandoned as the climate became too harsh and unpredictable for crops to survive. Societies that had begun to settle down were forced to disperse, returning to a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle simply to survive. This was not a minor setback. It was a full-scale reversal of human progress, delaying the widespread adoption of farming for centuries. Imagine the knowledge that was lost, the specific grains that were forgotten, the settled villages that were left to crumble. This event also coincides with the sudden extinction of magnificent megafauna like the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed cat. Their disappearance removed a critical food source and hunting partner for many human groups, creating another layer of crisis. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis forces us to confront a humbling possibility. The very dawn of civilization, the moment we began to mold the land to our will, may have been violently postponed by a random event in the depths of space. Our trajectory was not a straight line from simple to complex, but a path littered with cosmic interruptions. What other leaps forward have been lost to the stars? Rising waters tell a story older than history itself. As the last ice age receded, global sea levels climbed relentlessly, and around 5,600 years before the Common Era, this slow creep culminated in a cataclysm. The natural land bridge that was the Bosporus Strait could no longer hold back the Mediterranean Sea. Saltwater began to pour through in a thunderous, relentless cascade, crashing into the vast, low-lying basin that held the freshwater Black Sea. This was not a gentle rise. It was a violent inundation, a deluge that may have advanced over a mile each day, swallowing the coastal plains where early farming communities had thrived for generations. Marine archaeologist Robert Ballard, the man who found the Titanic, explored the Black Sea floor and discovered an ancient shoreline, complete with submerged structures and evidence of human habitation far beneath the waves. His findings lend powerful support to the theory that this was a real historical event of staggering proportions. For the people living there, it would have been their entire world vanishing beneath a wall of water. Their farms, their homes, their sacred places, all lost forever. Is it any wonder that this single, traumatic memory would echo for millennia? This catastrophe provides a stunningly plausible origin for the Great Flood myths found in cultures across the region, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the story of Noah's Ark. Survivors fled the rising tide, carrying with them not just their belongings, but their terrifying stories of a world cleansed by water. This massive displacement became an unexpected engine for change. Those fleeing farmers did not just disappear, they migrated westward into Europe and south into Anatolia, carrying their knowledge of domesticated crops and animals with them. They were refugees of an environmental collapse, but they were also pioneers. The very disaster that destroyed their homeland forced them to interact with hunter-gatherer populations, introducing agricultural techniques that would fundamentally reshape the continent. What began as a local tragedy ignited a wave of cultural diffusion, spreading new ways of life across vast distances. It is a profound and recurring pattern. A catastrophe that erases one world can, in its terrible wake, sow the seeds for a dozen new ones to emerge. 4,200 years ago, the world's first great empires began to crack under a relentless, invisible enemy. A mega-drought of unimaginable scale gripped the planet, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley and lasting for over a century. This was the 4.2 Kiloyear event, a climate catastrophe that did not arrive with fire or earthquake, but with a profound and devastating silence. The rain simply stopped, the life-giving monsoon patterns shifted, and ocean currents changed, turning fertile breadbaskets into dust bowls. For the sophisticated societies that had come to rely on predictable seasons and river floods, this was the beginning of the end. In Egypt, the Nile's annual inundation, the very heartbeat of the Old Kingdom, failed repeatedly. The pharaoh, once seen as a living god responsible for the cosmic order, lost his divine authority as his people starved. Grand pyramid building ceased, and the central government fragmented, plunging the realm into a dark age of famine and civil war. To the east, the mighty Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia faced the same fate. Ancient cuneiform tablets tell a haunting story of this era, describing it as the curse of Akkad. They speak of a time when no one could see another person's face, for the dust storms were so thick, and when hungry citizens rebelled against a system that could no longer feed them. The great city of Akkad itself was so thoroughly abandoned that its location remains lost to this day. Perhaps most mysterious of all was the fate of the Indus Valley civilization. This was a society renowned for its meticulously planned cities, with sophisticated water management and drainage systems. Yet when the rivers that sustained them dried up, their urban centers were gradually, systematically abandoned. There is little evidence of invasion or violent conflict, just a slow, deliberate migration away from the great metropolises as the water vanished. This event underscores a terrifying vulnerability. These were not primitive cultures, they were the most advanced and complex societies of their age, masters of architecture, administration, and trade. Yet they were all brought low by a change in the climate they could neither predict nor control. The collapse was so widespread that it forced a total reorganization of human life. The old models of centralized, godlike kings and vast grain storage bureaucracies had failed. In their wake, smaller, more resilient communities had to forge new ways of governing and surviving, rebuilding the very idea of civilization from the ground up. What does it say about our own complex world when the greatest threat can come not from armies, but from the sky itself? The island of Thera did not simply erupt, it disintegrated. Around 1,600 years before the Common Era, This volcano in the Aegean Sea unleashed one of the most violent geological events in human history, a blast comparable to the infamous Krakatoa. For the brilliant Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, just 70 miles to the south, this was not a distant rumble but an existential threat. The cataclysm began with earthquakes, warning tremors that surely rattled the magnificent palaces at Knossos. Then came the main event, a Plinian eruption that sent a column of superheated ash and rock towering miles into the sky. The island's core collapsed into the sea, creating the vast caldera we see today at Santorini. This sudden collapse triggered a tsunami, a wall of water that raced across the open sea and slammed into the northern coast of Crete with unimaginable force. The Minoans were a maritime power, their wealth and identity built upon the sea. In a single day, the sea turned against them, scouring their coastal cities, ports, and fleets from the map. The devastation did not stop at the shoreline. Thick layers of volcanic ash, pumice, and toxic gases smothered the island, poisoning the soil and choking the air. The sophisticated Minoan culture, renowned for its vibrant art, complex plumbing, and an undeciphered script known as Linear A, could not withstand this multi-front assault. Their trade networks, which stretched across the Mediterranean, disintegrated as their ships were lost and their ports destroyed. The grand palaces, the administrative hearts of their society, were abandoned and never fully reoccupied. The eruption's reach was staggering. The volcanic plume cast a pall over the entire region, and this climatic disruption may be the source of strange accounts in Egyptian records that speak of days of darkness and the Nile running red, potentially from ash-contaminated waters. With a dominant Minoan power suddenly and violently removed, a power vacuum emerged in the Aegean. Into this void stepped the Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland, a more militaristic and austere culture. They absorbed the scattered remnants of Minoan knowledge, adapted their writing into a new script called Linear B, and rose to become the new dominant power of the region. The fiery end of Thera did not just erase a civilization, it cleared the stage for a new actor, one whose legends of heroes and gods would echo for millennia. How many of our greatest myths are simply the whispered memories of real, world-shattering disasters? The intricate networks of the late Bronze Age formed a world system of staggering complexity. Kings exchanged letters written on clay tablets, detailing shipments of copper, tin, and glass across the Mediterranean. Grand palaces in Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant administered economies that seemed unshakable. Then, within the span of a single human lifetime, it all came crashing down. Around the 12th century before the Common Era, a perfect storm of calamities shattered this interconnected world. It was not one disaster, but a cascade of them, each one amplifying the next. A prolonged drought linked to a shifting climate caused widespread crop failure and famine. This internal weakness was exploited by mysterious invaders remembered only as the Sea Peoples, marauders who attacked coastlines and disrupted the vital sea lanes that were the empire's lifeblood. To make matters worse, evidence suggests a cluster of major earthquakes further damaged key cities. The system was being attacked from every possible angle. A desperate letter found in the ruins of the city of Ugarit captures the moment perfectly. The city's king, under siege, wrote a plea for help to the neighboring king of Alashia. The reply was chilling. It read, in essence, "What can I do? My own ships are also lost, my cities are burned, and if enemy ships appear, you must face them alone." Ugarit was soon abandoned, its writing system and its culture vanishing into the earth. This was the Bronze Age collapse, and its consequences were absolute. The great Hittite Empire in Anatolia vanished completely. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece were burned and deserted. the knowledge of complex administrative scripts like Linear B and many forms of cuneiform was lost, plunging the entire Eastern Mediterranean into a dark age where literacy itself became a rare skill. This was not a mere political transition, it was a civilizational amnesia. Yet, from the ashes of these centralized, palace-driven empires, a new social order slowly emerged. The collapse of top-down power structures created a vacuum. In its place, smaller, more independent city-states and tribal confederations began to form. Without the overwhelming dominance of a few great kings, there was room for experimentation in governance, in warfare, and in culture. This fractured landscape would eventually give rise to the classical world of the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and the Israelites. The unraveling of one age, as total and terrifying as it was, became the necessary condition for the birth of another. It forces us to question the very foundations of our own interconnected globe. How many simultaneous failures would it take to overwhelm our resilient, modern systems? The Assyrian Empire was a machine built for war, its armies marching across the Middle East with terrifying efficiency. Yet even this seemingly invincible superpower of the 9th century before the Common Era could not command the skies. A series of brutal, repeated droughts began to choke the heartland of the empire, turning fields to dust and emptying grain silos. Cuneiform tablets, the empire's own meticulous records, shift from boasting of conquests to desperate accounts of digging canals and frantic efforts to store what little food remained. The state's entire economy, which fed its vast military and administrative class, was built on an agricultural surplus that was rapidly vanishing. This was not a single, swift catastrophe, but a slow, grinding pressure that exposed the empire's deepest vulnerabilities. Famine bred discontent, and internal rebellions erupted as provinces struggled under the twin burdens of imperial taxation and ecological collapse. The very act of overexpansion, which had once brought immense wealth, now became a fatal liability, stretching resources and administrative control to a breaking point. The Assyrian war machine, so effective against human enemies, had no defense against a changing climate. This prolonged environmental stress did not deliver a killing blow on its own, but it critically weakened the empire's foundations, contributing to a decline that would, centuries later, allow rivals like Babylon to finally rise and dismantle it. The story of Assyria is a stark lesson in imperial fragility. It demonstrates that the greatest threat to a militaristic superpower may not be a rival army, but a prolonged drought that withers its fields and starves its people. The struggle for water and food forced adaptations in governance and infrastructure that echo into our own time, a timeless reminder that geopolitical fortunes are forever tied to the most fundamental of resources. How many of today's power struggles have their roots not in ideology, but in simple, desperate scarcity? Deep in the jungles of Central America, the silence of abandoned stone cities tells a story of a sophisticated world that simply walked away. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, the classic Maya civilization, a network of powerful city-states renowned for their celestial observatories and towering pyramids, underwent a catastrophic collapse. This was not a single event, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. Paleoclimatic data extracted from ancient lake sediments paints a stark picture, revealing a series of intense, prolonged droughts that gripped the region for decades. The rains that fed their intricate reservoir systems and sustained their maize-based agriculture simply failed, season after season, but the environment was only part of the problem. The Maya themselves had contributed to their own vulnerability through widespread deforestation, clearing vast tracts of jungle for agriculture and plaster, which in turn reduced local rainfall and amplified the effects of the drought. This environmental pressure ignited a firestorm of social and political chaos. The same stone inscriptions that once recorded the divine deeds of kings began to tell a different story, one of escalating warfare between rival city-states and the sudden cessation of dynastic lines. The ruling class, whose power was based on their perceived ability to communicate with the gods and ensure rain and fertility, lost all legitimacy when the skies remained empty. One by one, the great ceremonial centers like Tikal and Palenque were abandoned, their grand plazas and palaces reclaimed by the relentless jungle. This was a profound reset for Mesoamerica. The center of power and cultural innovation shifted north to new sites like Chichen Itza, where different forms of governance and water management emerged. The collapse forced a radical reorganization of Maya society, moving away from the grandiose, god-like kings of the classic period toward more collective and pragmatic systems. The lesson written in the ruins is a timeless one. It demonstrates with chilling clarity how environmental mismanagement can act as a multiplier, turning a climate crisis into a full-blown civilizational collapse. Their story is a haunting reminder that even the most brilliant and advanced societies are not insulated from the consequences of their own relationship with the land. This pattern of internal strain meeting external pressure was not unique to the New World, as the great empires of the Mediterranean were about to discover. A ship docking at a bustling port brought more than just silk and grain. In the year 541, at the height of the Byzantine Empire, the first victims of the Justinianic Plague fell ill in the Egyptian port of Pelusium. This was not a local outbreak, but the beginning of a pandemic that would ride the very trade routes that powered the civilized world. The culprit was Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague, carried by fleas on black rats that scurried from ship to ship and warehouse to warehouse. From that single point of entry, the disease exploded outward, carried by merchants and soldiers to every corner of the empire and beyond. Within a year, it had reached the magnificent capital of Constantinople itself. The historian Procopius was an eyewitness to the horror, and his accounts are chilling. He described a city gripped by fever, with victims developing dark, swollen buboes in their groins and armpits. The death toll rose so quickly that the city's organized burial systems collapsed. Corpses were piled inside towers and simply thrown over the city walls. At its peak, Procopius claims 10,000 people were dying every single day. The plague did not respect borders. It swept through North Africa, surged into Europe, and may have even reached as far as Britain, leaving mass graves in its wake. The total death toll is estimated in the tens of millions, a staggering portion of the global population at the time. But the true catastrophe was not just the body count, it was the systemic failure that followed. The Byzantine Empire under Emperor Justinian was at a pivotal moment, actively reconquering lost territories in Italy and North Africa to restore the glory of the Roman Empire. The plague eviscerated these ambitions. The army, decimated by disease, could no longer hold its gains. The economy, which relied on a massive population to farm the land and pay taxes, went into a tailspin. With fewer taxpayers and consumers, trade withered and the imperial treasury emptied. This massive biological shock left the empire critically weakened, its resources stretched to a breaking point. Political consequences were profound and lasting. The empire's sudden frailty created a power vacuum on its frontiers. In the Balkans, Slavic peoples were able to move into territories the weakened Roman legions could no longer defend. More significantly, the Eastern Roman Empire's exhaustion laid the groundwork for the explosive expansion of the Arab armies a century later, who would conquer vast Byzantine provinces with relative ease. The Justinianic Plague is a stark lesson in the paradox of connectivity. the very networks that bind civilizations together and fuel their growth, the trade routes and shipping lanes, can become highways for catastrophe. A single pathogen hitching a ride on a merchant vessel can cripple an economy, halt an army, and permanently reshape the map of the world. It forces us to wonder, in our own hyper-connected age, what invisible threats are traveling along our modern trade routes, and what political orders they might one day unravel. The year 1315 marked the beginning of a slow, creeping horror. A mysterious shift in the climate brought unending cold rains and a sun that seemed to vanish for years on end. This was not a sudden impact or a volcanic winter, but a gradual drowning of the European continent. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a catastrophe of water and cold, where the very soil turned to a soupy, unplantable mire. Seeds rotted in the ground, and entire harvests were lost across the continent. The price of grain skyrocketed beyond the reach of ordinary people, and chronicles from the time tell of desperate crowds swarming the streets, gnawing on roots and bark. In the most extreme desperation, some reports even speak of cannibalism, a final, gruesome testament to societal breakdown. The crisis did not stop with human suffering. The same weather that destroyed crops also killed off vast herds of sheep and cattle, wiping out the wool and leather industries and crippling local economies at their foundation. This was more than a food shortage. It was a total systems failure that struck at every level of medieval life. The feudal system, built on the promise of a lord's protection in exchange for a peasant's labor, was exposed as a hollow bargain. When the lords could no longer provide security or food, the social contract shattered. Widespread banditry and peasant revolts became common, as the starving masses turned their rage against a system that had failed them. The famine also left a deeper, more insidious legacy. A population weakened by years of malnutrition was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. That spark arrived a generation later in the form of the Black Death, which found its victims already vulnerable and their immune systems compromised. Yet, even in this darkness, the seeds of change were sown. The sheer scale of the disaster forced a painful but necessary evolution in agriculture. Farmers, facing total ruin, began to experiment with new methods. They moved away from the inefficient two-field system and slowly adopted three-field crop rotation, which kept more land productive and improved soil fertility. They also began to plant more resilient crops like oats and rye. The Great Famine demonstrates with brutal clarity how a climate anomaly can ripple through a society, breaking its institutions, eroding its traditions, and ultimately forcing it to adapt in ways that slowly, over generations, reshape the very fabric of daily life. It is a pattern we have seen before, where a crisis of scarcity does not just cause suffering, but actively dismantles an old world to make room for a new one. Just a generation after the Great Famine, a far more efficient killer arrived on the shores of Europe. In 1347, trading ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina, carrying a cargo far more lethal than any weapon. The sailors were already dying, their bodies covered in dark, oozing swellings. The Black Death had arrived. The bubonic plague, carried by fleas on black rats, moved with terrifying speed, following the very trade routes that were the lifeblood of the medieval world. Within 4 years, it had swept across the continent, leaving an almost unimaginable toll in its wake. An estimated 1/3 of Europe's entire population, tens of millions of people, perished. The social fabric tore under the strain. Mass graves became a common, horrifying sight. Entire villages were left empty, their fields fallow and their homes silent. The old certainties of life and death, of divine protection and feudal duty, evaporated in the face of such random, indiscriminate suffering. The church, which promised salvation, stood powerless as its priests died alongside their congregations, shattering its moral authority. But from this devastation emerged an unexpected revolution. With so many workers dead, a profound labor shortage gave the survivors unprecedented leverage. For the first time, peasants and artisans could demand higher wages for their work. The rigid feudal system, which had bound serfs to the land for generations, began to crumble under this new economic reality. A new class of merchants and skilled urban craftsmen rose to prominence, their wealth based on commerce and talent rather than inherited land and title. This massive redistribution of wealth and power broke the stagnation of the Middle Ages. The unquestioned authority of the church was challenged, opening intellectual space for new ideas. A renewed interest in the human experience, in science and art for their own sake, began to take root. The catastrophe that nearly destroyed Europe also cleared the ground for the Renaissance. It is a brutal but powerful paradox of history that a demographic disaster could shatter a stagnant social order so completely that it made room for a new world to be born. What other periods of brilliant cultural flourishing were preceded by unimaginable loss? A slow, relentless chill began to grip the planet just as the medieval warm period faded into memory. This was the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift so gradual it was almost imperceptible within a single lifetime, yet its cumulative effect over centuries would reshape societies across the globe. Glaciers in the Alps advanced, swallowing entire farms and villages. In Europe, the Thames River in London froze solid so frequently that frost fairs, complete with shops and festivities, were held right on the ice. While picturesque, this deep freeze was a symptom of a broken system. The same frozen rivers that hosted carnivals were paralyzed trade routes, preventing the movement of grain and goods between regions. When one area's harvest failed, there was no way to bring in relief from another. This fragility culminated in disasters like the Great Famine, where years of cold, wet weather rotted crops in the field and led to mass starvation. The cooling did not just mean colder winters, it meant shorter, unreliable growing seasons. Harvests that once seemed certain now failed with terrifying regularity, pushing populations to the brink. The tension born from this prolonged scarcity simmered for generations, and many historians argue it contributed to the brutal conflicts of the era, such as the 30 Years' War, where desperate armies ravaged the countryside for food. Yet human ingenuity is never static. Faced with a colder world, people adapted in remarkable ways. In architecture, houses began to feature smaller rooms and lower ceilings to better retain heat, and the iconic central fireplace evolved into more efficient corner hearths. Farmers, after repeated failures, were forced to abandon traditional crops for hardier varieties like rye and oats. They developed new crop rotation techniques to nurse more life from the struggling soil. Across the Atlantic, Native American societies demonstrated profound resilience. As the climate cooled and the range of the animals they hunted shifted, they innovated entirely new survival strategies. Some groups in the Great Plains, for instance, intensified their use of the bison, developing more sophisticated communal hunting techniques that allowed them to thrive in a harsher environment. The lesson of the Little Ice Age is not one of a single dramatic explosion, but of a persistent, grinding pressure. It proves that a catastrophe does not need to be sudden to be transformative. A change of just a degree or two in average temperature, sustained over generations, can redraw the map of human possibility, forcing adaptations that slowly, irrevocably, alter the course of history itself. A hidden passenger crossed the Atlantic with Columbus, one that would prove far more lethal than any soldier or weapon. When Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico, they brought with them a biological arsenal of diseases to which the indigenous populations of the Americas had absolutely no immunity. Viruses like smallpox, measles, and influenza raced through the continents with a virulence that defied comprehension, acting as an invisible vanguard for the European armies that followed. Within a single generation, up to 90% of the population was wiped out. The Spanish chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who marched with Cortés, described the horrific scenes in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. He wrote of houses, streets, and squares littered with the bodies of the dead, a society so ravaged by disease that it could no longer bury its own people. This was not a battle, it was a demographic collapse of a scale the world had rarely seen. The mighty Aztec and Inca empires, with their complex social structures and powerful armies, were hollowed out from within. Their rulers died, their priests perished, and their farmers vanished, leaving a societal void that the conquistadors could simply walk into. The conquest was not a triumph of superior military technology alone, but a tragic accident of biology, where the long-separated ecosystems of the Old World and the New finally collided with catastrophic results. This Columbian Exchange, as it is known, was a two-way street, but the traffic was brutally unequal. While the Americas received devastating plagues, Europe gained new world-changing crops like the potato and maize, which would go on to fuel population booms across the Eastern Hemisphere. The global balance of power shifted irrevocably, not through a fair contest of civilizations, but through a biological tragedy that reset the entire human landscape of two continents. The silence that fell over emptied cities and untended fields created a vacuum that European colonization filled, forever altering the course of history. How many of the world's current power structures were built not on ingenuity, but on the tragic, unintended consequences of a germ? 1816 was a year the seasons forgot. In New England, farmers watched helplessly as snow fell in June and frost blackened their fields in July. Ponds remained frozen in Pennsylvania through what should have been high summer, and across Europe, the sky was a permanent, dull gray, unleashing relentless cold rain that rotted the few crops that managed to sprout. This was the direct consequence of an event that had occurred a year earlier and half a world away. The massive eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia had blasted an almost unimaginable volume of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This veil of particles circled the globe, reflecting sunlight back into space and plunging the planet into a volcanic winter. The resulting famine was severe. In Switzerland, the desperation was so profound that people were seen eating moss and fighting over stray cats. This crisis sparked food riots across Europe and forced a mass migration of farmers from New England, who abandoned their stony, frozen fields and headed west in search of fertile soil in Ohio and Indiana, accelerating the American frontier's expansion. Yet within this global hardship, creativity found a strange foothold. A group of writers, including Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, were confined to a villa on Lake Geneva by the incessantly gloomy weather. To pass the time during what they called the year without a summer, they challenged each other to write ghost stories. From that forced indoor confinement, Mary Shelley conceived her masterpiece, Frankenstein, a tale born from the same unnatural cold that was gripping the world outside. The catastrophe also spurred very practical innovations. The widespread failure of oats, which starved and killed countless horses, created an urgent need for personal transportation. This directly inspired a German inventor named Carl Dryas to develop his running machine, a precursor to the modern bicycle. The eruption of a single mountain, a local geological event, thus rippled outward to reshape art, spur migration, and catalyze invention. It stands as a powerful, modern example of how a natural disaster can reset human endeavor, forcing both survival and unexpected brilliance from the depths of a global crisis. What other works of art or invention were born not from comfort but from necessity and disaster? A single crop can become a nation's lifeline, and its failure a national tomb. In the damp Irish autumn of 1845, farmers watched in horror as their potato plants, the very foundation of their existence, blackened and rotted in the fields. A mysterious blight, a water mold known as Phytophthora infestans, had arrived from North America, and it turned the staple food of the Irish population into a slimy, inedible mush. For the rural poor of Ireland, the potato was not just a food, it was the entire economic system. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family for a year, allowing them to pay their rent to Anglo-Irish landlords with the profits from other small crops or a pig. When the blight struck, it did not merely create a food shortage, it vaporized the entire economy of rural Ireland. The first year was a crisis, but the following years were a cataclysm, as the blight returned again and again, destroying any hope of recovery. Starving families were evicted from their homes for failing to pay rent, their cottages torn down around them. Mass starvation set in, followed by devastating diseases like typhus and cholera that preyed upon the malnourished and the desperate huddled in overcrowded workhouses. The British government's response was a tragic combination of ideological neglect and administrative failure. The prevailing economic doctrine of laissez-faire argued against interfering with the market, so food exports from Ireland to England continued even as people starved. Relief efforts were often too little, too late, and some public works projects were intentionally made harsh to discourage dependency. This was not merely a natural disaster, it was a disaster profoundly shaped by political choices. The psychological and cultural impact was searing. The Irish language, already in decline, was dealt a near-fatal blow as the worst suffering occurred in the predominantly Irish-speaking Western regions. The relationship between Ireland and Britain was poisoned for generations, fueling a powerful new wave of Irish nationalism and a demand for independence. But the catastrophe also forced a desperate reinvention of an entire people. To escape certain death, over 2 million people fled Ireland in coffin ships, so named for their horrific conditions and high mortality rates. They flooded into cities like Boston, New York, and Liverpool, forming vast diaspora communities that would forever alter the cultural and political fabric of the United States and the British Empire. The Ireland that emerged from this crucible was a different nation, its population halved, its landscape scarred by empty villages, and its spirit forged in a newfound determination for self-governance. The famine stands as a haunting lesson in the fragility of a monoculture, and a chilling example of how political failure can magnify a natural tragedy into a civilizational reset. The very soil of the American heartland began to rise up against those who had mistreated it. Throughout the 1930s, a profound drought settled over the Great Plains, but it was human action that turned this dry spell into a full-blown catastrophe. Years of deep plowing had torn up the native, drought-resistant prairie grasses that held the topsoil in place. When the rain stopped, there was nothing left to anchor the earth. The wind did the rest, scooping up millions of tons of fine, powdered soil and hurling it into the sky. These were the black blizzards, dust storms so immense they blotted out the sun, turning day into night. They rolled across the landscape like towering, suffocating waves, burying fences, covering homes, and filling lungs with a gritty, choking dust that caused a deadly pneumonia. This was the Dust Bowl, an environmental collapse that displaced more than 2 million people. Whole families, their farms literally blown away, packed their few belongings into rattletrap cars and joined a desperate exodus westward, following Route 66 to a promised land in California that was often far less welcoming than they had dreamed. The scale of this disaster forced the federal government to act in unprecedented ways. It became a powerful catalyst for President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, leading to the creation of agencies like the Soil Conservation Service. For the first time, the government began teaching farmers new techniques like contour plowing and crop rotation to protect the land. They planted vast windbreaks of trees to act as natural barriers against the wind. This was a fundamental shift, an admission that the soil itself was a national resource that required protection. The Dust Bowl stands as a stark, man-made chapter in our history of resets. It was not a volcano or an asteroid, but a disaster born from a fundamental misunderstanding of the landscape. It demonstrates with terrifying clarity how human ambition, when divorced from ecological wisdom, can unleash forces that dismantle entire communities and force a painful, nationwide reckoning. The policies and conservation methods born from that crisis still shape our farmland today, a lasting legacy of a time when the earth itself rebelled. And it begs a pressing modern question as we face our own changing climate. Are we listening to the warnings written in that dust? The trenches of the First World War created the perfect breeding ground for a predator no soldier could fight. In the spring of 1918, a new and terrifying strain of H1N1 influenza began its silent march across the globe. It did not target the weak and the elderly as flu typically did. Instead, it ravaged the young and healthy, their robust immune systems triggering catastrophic cytokine storms that filled their lungs with fluid, often turning their skin a dusky blue from lack of oxygen. This was the Spanish flu, a misnomer born from neutral Spain's uncensored press, while warring nations suppressed news to maintain morale. The conflict acted as a super-spreader event on an unprecedented scale. Troops crammed into troop ships and muddy trenches passed the virus back and forth, and when they were demobilized at the war's end, they carried it home to every corner of the earth. By the time the pandemic subsided in 1920, it had infected an estimated one-third of the entire global population and claimed tens of millions of lives, a death toll that dwarfed that of the war itself. The sheer scale of the suffering overwhelmed every system in its path. Hospitals were inundated, nurses and doctors fell ill, and cities ran out of coffins. Makeshift morgues were set up in ice rinks, and mass graves were dug by steam shovel. The catastrophe exposed a stunning global vulnerability to infectious disease, a weakness that could not be solved by armies or diplomacy. Yet, from this profound failure emerged a new determination. The pandemic sparked a revolution in public health, creating a powerful impetus for international cooperation. The League of Nations, formed in the war's aftermath, established a health organization, a direct precursor to the World Health Organization, dedicated to tracking and containing disease across borders. The field of epidemiology was transformed, with scientists beginning to systematically track viral spread and understand the importance of early intervention. This collective trauma also reset daily life in subtle but lasting ways. The importance of basic hygiene was seared into the public consciousness, paving the way for widespread acceptance of practices like routine hand-washing. The drive to understand what had happened fueled massive new investments in medical research, laying the foundational stones for the modern science of virology. The 1918 flu stands as a brutal paradox, a biological catastrophe that, by revealing our deepest vulnerabilities, ultimately forced humanity to build a stronger, more coordinated defense against the invisible threats we share. It is a stark reminder that our greatest global challenges demand global solutions, forged in the difficult lessons of a shared past. A clear August morning in 1945 was split by a light brighter than 1,000 suns. This was not merely a new weapon, but a fundamental rewriting of the laws of destruction. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did more than end a world war. They shattered humanity's very conception of its own power. The immediate devastation was apocalyptic, leveling cities and vaporizing lives in an instant. But the horror did not end with the blast. A new, invisible killer emerged, radiation sickness, which claimed countless more in the weeks and years that followed, leaving a legacy of cancer and genetic damage that would haunt generations. This was a technological catastrophe of a different order, one where human ingenuity had unlocked a force capable of unraveling civilization itself. The end of World War II did not bring lasting peace, but instead birthed the Cold War, a 40-year standoff defined by a terrifying new doctrine: mutual assured destruction. The logic was as simple as it was chilling. If both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to annihilate the other completely, then neither would dare use them. The entire planet was held hostage by this balance of terror. An arms race of unimaginable scale consumed the world's resources, as the United States and the Soviet Union built arsenals large enough to end human life many times over. This perpetual state of fear reset global politics entirely, forcing a new kind of diplomacy conducted not with armies, but with threats and proxy wars fought in distant lands. Yet from this abyss, a powerful global consciousness also emerged. The very real prospect of annihilation sparked an international anti-nuclear movement, a collective plea for sanity from ordinary citizens who understood that the next catastrophe would have no survivors and no recovery. This new reality forced humanity to confront an existential question for the first time. Could our own technological advancement become the very instrument of our extinction? The shadow of the mushroom cloud forever altered our trajectory, proving that the most profound resets are not always delivered by nature, but can be forged in our own laboratories. How do we navigate a future where our greatest tools and our greatest threats are one and the same? The glow of the nuclear reactor core became a beacon of unimaginable peril. In April 1986, a flawed safety test at the Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine spiraled into the worst nuclear disaster in history. The resulting explosion and fire did not just destroy a building, it ripped open the reactor itself, hurling radioactive material high into the atmosphere. For days, the Soviet government attempted to conceal the catastrophe, even as radiation detectors in Sweden began to sound the alarm. This was a failure of technology magnified by a fatal culture of secrecy. The initial explosion claimed lives, but the true, insidious horror was the fallout. A radioactive cloud drifted across Europe, contaminating farmland and forests from Scandinavia to the British Isles. The nearby city of Pripyat was evacuated, its 40,000 residents told to bring only a few belongings for a short trip, a trip from which they would never return. The Soviet Union mobilized hundreds of thousands of liquidators, soldiers, firefighters, and miners, who worked in brutally short shifts to contain the blaze and entomb the shattered reactor in a concrete sarcophagus, often with little more than handmade lead shields for protection. Their heroism came at an incalculable cost to their health. The political fallout was just as profound. The disaster shattered the myth of Soviet technological superiority and exposed the rot at the heart of its centralized, unaccountable system. The cover-up, followed by a reluctant, belated admission, discredited the Communist Party and fueled independence movements in Ukraine and Belarus, directly contributing to the unraveling of the USSR just 5 years later. Chernobyl was a brutal lesson in the limits of human control. It forced a global reckoning with the Faustian bargain of nuclear power, spurring sweeping safety reforms and international cooperation on radiation monitoring. Public trust in scientific authority was deeply shaken, and energy policies around the world began a slow but decisive pivot, with many nations accelerating investments in solar, wind, and other renewable sources. The silent, invisible contamination of the exclusion zone stands as a permanent monument to a simple, terrifying truth. Our most powerful tools carry the potential for our own undoing, demanding not just engineering excellence, but unshakable humility and eternal vigilance. A virus barely visible under a microscope brought the humming engine of globalization to a sudden, grinding halt. The COVID-19 pandemic, emerging in late 2019, was the first truly global catastrophe of the modern, hyper-connected era. This was not a localized disaster like a volcano or a flood. It was a simultaneous shock to every nation on Earth, a stark test of our interconnected systems. Within months, a pathogen had circumnavigated the globe, carried by the very airplanes and cargo ships that defined our modern world. Borders slammed shut, international travel evaporated, and bustling city centers fell into an eerie silence. The global economy, a complex web of just-in-time supply chains, shuddered as factories closed and shipments stalled. For the first time in living memory, the entire human experience contracted to the walls of our own homes. Lockdowns became a universal, if deeply isolating, reality. But this forced isolation became a powerful catalyst for change. The world did not simply stop, it adapted at a breathtaking pace. Offices emptied, and within weeks, remote work evolved from a niche perk to a mainstream necessity, accelerating a digital transformation that might have taken decades. Education, healthcare, and even social gatherings migrated online, revealing both the potential and the profound limitations of a virtual existence. The race for a vaccine became a monumental scientific endeavor, compressing years of research and development into mere months through unprecedented global collaboration. Yet the pandemic also acted as a harsh spotlight, illuminating deep and persistent fractures. It exposed glaring inequities in healthcare access, where your survival could depend on your zip code or your nationality. It revealed the fragility of our service economies and the precarious existence of essential workers. The very tools that allowed some to work safely from home were unavailable to many, deepening existing social and economic divides. This shared global trauma has forced a fundamental reset of our societal norms. It sparked urgent debates about the balance between personal freedom and public health, about the responsibilities of governments to protect their citizens, and about the meaning of preparedness in a world where a new virus can emerge at any moment. The pandemic proved that our greatest strength, our global connectivity, is also our greatest vulnerability. It challenged our definition of resilience, showing that it is no longer just about strong walls or stocked granaries, but about agile healthcare systems, robust digital infrastructure, and most importantly, the capacity for global cooperation in the face of a common threat. The silent streets of 2020 are already fading from memory, but the questions the pandemic raised about how we live, work, and protect one another in a crowded world will define our trajectory for generations to come.